Welcome everybody. This is our last session of today, and we have three speakers for you: Jon Fancey, Bec Leyons, and Chris Hauser. Jon and Bec we've met earlier today, but for Chris, it's his speaker debut at Integrate. And the topic of the session is about the modernization of integrations. So let's quickly hand over to you. So I would say, go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, we're coming to you live from Washington and Australia. So fingers crossed everything goes well. What we're going to do today is talk to you about modernizing your integration environments. That the intent here really is good. We're going to cover a bunch of content covering maybe you have IBM environments, you have existing BizTalk investments, and you really want to kind of be able to embrace the cloud as well. But sometimes you can't dictate kind of where things actually run. And this is where Azure Integration Services with the new capabilities we have kind of comes in. So with that, let's kind of move forward. So we're going to look at how to modernize your integration environments. We know they're complex, by their very nature. You've probably got a ton of stuff that you need to deal with. We're going to look at IBM investments that we're making in Logic Apps and how that will help you with your modernization and migration. Again, the same with BizTalk, and see how we're doing there in terms of our migration tooling, and then looking at the roadmap for that. And then we're going to finish off with a few questions for you to make this a little more interactive. So the first question, right, is like, why is it all this stuff together in this session? Well, it's really what you see here, that everybody has the same problem. They've got old stuff, they've got new stuff, you've got some things on premises, and you've probably got some things in the cloud. And having to deal with all of this, keeping the lights on, running your business at the same time as finding the time to kind of build out the new is often what causes this sort of inertia and this problem of how to just get going and actually start being able to embrace the cloud and moving to a cloud first kind of mentality. There's lots of choices in terms of how you do this, in terms of being able to lift and shift and just picking things up in VMs. And we've seen a lot of customers doing that with BizTalk and being able to kind of take some of the advantage of Azure and having an IaaS approach where you don't need to provision all the VMs and manage the underlying infrastructure, through to being able to modernize. This often falls in the category of how do I containerize existing workloads and get more of the benefits and start moving towards cloud native, and being able to apply some of the things we talked about earlier in terms of being able to put DevOps on top of that, automate the pipelines. And then there's rewrite, which is often the most attractive, but also the most amount of work, and therefore can be the most problematic of like, well, if I had nothing, this is how I would start. These are the technologies I want to use. And to us, integration services is really the glue that can connect all of these different problems together on how you can take old and new, cloud and on-prem, and create a mesh and knit them together into your integration portfolio and keep it manageable, reduce the complexity of that, and kind of move forward with what you're trying to do. So I'm going to hand you over to Bec now, who's going to dig into this in a little bit more detail.
Awesome. Thank you, Jon. Okay, so I'm going to build off what Jon kicked us off with and talk about why and how integration is evolving. Traditionally, organizations predominantly operated within their network boundary of their own data centers. Within our data centers would be hundreds, if not thousands in some cases, line of business applications, all requiring simple to complex interconnectivity and orchestration. In this context, integration solutions were deployed to act as the grand central station of our application ecosystem, providing simplicity and a single point of configuration. Now, this has been the case for over 20 years. Now, with new paradigms comes a need for change and need for modernization. So one of those paradigms and changes is mobile. It's not surprising, especially in the world that we live in 2020 and 2021, that almost all employees now expect to access a line of business applications from mobile devices or from on the go, which is fueling a huge demand for mobile applications in the enterprise. If users can't access their data easily, it impacts their productivity. The second trend that's been going on for a number of years now is the move from traditionally hosted applications, such as for payroll, email, and more, are now moving to cheaper and simpler cloud-based SaaS counterparts. Now, the third particular paradigm, as I'm sure we're all aware, we've been talking a lot about the cloud, is the migration or modernization to cloud-based technologies. So to lower total cost of ownership, improve efficiencies, and take advantage of the power and scale like we've never seen before, organizations are modernizing and migrating legacy business applications onto new serverless cloud technologies. Now, a trend within that is a move from our monolithic applications to microservices and highly distributed applications, including more complexities and communication needs for our integration platform to handle. If you want to see my session earlier today, I talk about how we can facilitate integration in a distributed world. And last but certainly not least, we're bringing connectivity requirements to more things. The Internet of Things, retail, manufacturing, mining, health, and more are all moving rapidly into this world of smart devices, all of which are generating more messages and data than we've ever seen before. So all these new paradigms raise questions we need to ask of our current integration technology, as well as our applications themselves. With all this new data pumping through, with all these new points of integration, am I able to scale my platform effectively? Do I need to look to something that is more distributed along with my distributed applications? And is my integration solution now a bottleneck? And if any of those questions are difficult to answer, our traditional integration solutions might not be the answer to all our problems, which is why we need to think about extending and modernizing our integration and application capabilities. And this is where Azure Application Insights, not Azure Application Insights, I blame the morning, it's 4:30 here. This is where Azure Integration Services comes into play. So when we distill down what modern integration is, at its core requirements and protocols, you have APIs, you're working with events, you're working with messages, workflows and orchestrations, ETL and data batch processing, and you're working with code to implement your business logic. Microsoft has designed our suite of services to specifically cater to these different integration scenarios. So if you need to work with APIMs, you can work with API management. If you have events for event triggered systems, you've got Event Grid. If you need reliable messaging like the message box of BizTalk, you've got Service Bus. If you need orchestration, moving information from point to point and application to application, you've got Logic Apps. Data Factory for rich data processing pipelines and adding ML and enriching different data as it goes from source to sink. And Azure Functions for all things custom code on top of that. Now, unlike our traditional integration services platforms, these are all individually deployable, they're individually scalable, and they're pay as you go, which means they're really flexible to help you get started and really great to add on as extra modernizations on top of your legacy systems. They're designed to be used together as well. So you can use them individually, you can use them together, and they take full advantage of the cloud with availability, resiliency, scalability, low latency, all of that out of the box. So rather than you having to manage and maintain that, it's now abstracted away from you to the cloud provider. Integrators are building applications and integrations of the future on Azure today by using this set of cloud native capabilities. And you'll be able to use these particular set of cloud native capabilities to deploy your solutions on-prem or wherever you need your integrations to run tomorrow. This is where, and we've talked about it in a couple of sessions today, this is where the new Azure Arc capabilities comes into play. So Azure Arc enabled application and integration services means that you can now run your integrations wherever you need to integrate with your backend systems of record. I know some of the blockers that have arisen for modernization is, well, I'd love to modernize, but all of my applications and line business apps are still on-prem. So how do I do that? Well, this is a solution to that. You can now write your Logic Apps, orchestrations, facade with API management, manage eventing through Event Grid, write custom code with functions and app service, and run those bits of functionality wherever you need them to integrate, whether it be on-prem, on the edge, on a laptop on your desk, on all the other clouds, and so on. So pretty exciting there. So what this means is that, as I've mentioned, you use the same set of services as you're comfortable in creating integrations. You don't have to choose or have that particular balancing point of whether I want the productivity of PaaS, which a lot of people love, but having to give up the control of the infrastructure, which we might be used to in a traditional on-premises sense. With Azure Arc enabled application platform services, we can take advantage of the PaaS benefits of Logic Apps, of API Man, and so on, but also maintain control of our environments and apply policy and apply networking, all those good things that we need as an organization. And to get past our security team, we can still do that while taking advantage of all these cool features. And of course, the big one that I've mentioned, just being able to run this anywhere is an exciting endeavor that the Azure Application Platform team is taking on. So stay tuned for more things coming in that particular ecosystem, but this is definitely something that we see as an unblocker to a lot of organizations to modernize. So distilling it down, why modernize? And what does this mean for my business? Now, there are a lot of technical benefits to modernizing, such as being able to scale, being able to innovate on the fly, being able to use modern paradigms and modern code languages and drag and drop interfaces like with Logic Apps. But for the business, it's a couple of things of why we need to modernize. Agility, being able to be agile in the market, create new functionality rapidly, rather than having to go through all the traditional waterfall and testing cycles of our older implementations. The ability to scale, that's another one, that's a big one. When we run things on premises, we have to make sure that we plan for capacity. And sometimes, if worst case, we don't plan correctly. And on the other end of the spectrum, if we over provision, then we are paying for something that we don't necessarily need. So moving to the cloud and moving to these types of resources can actually help you scale on the fly when you need and scale right back down so you can get better total cost of ownership. Security, being able to provide modern paradigms for security and take advantage of something like Microsoft Azure's rich ecosystem of security tools. We've got things like Azure Sentinel, Azure AAD, which are leading class security services. So take advantage of those to lock down your systems and enhance the security of your end-to-end integrations. Innovation, with all these new services, you constantly are up to date with the latest change in that particular platform. So as we add support for new protocols, as we add support for new paradigms, you can actually start developing with them and be more innovative and more agile without being bogged down by your legacy protocols. So that is a very quick overview of why modernize. It's definitely an exciting time to be moving to these cloud native solutions, particularly the fact that they don't have to be cloud. So I'm going to pass over to Chris, who's going to be talking about how we can use Logic Apps and modern protocols to extend our IBM mainframes.
Hello, I'm Chris Hauser, a program manager on the Logic Apps team. I'm responsible for our on-prem product, Host Integration Server, and our mainframe integration in Logic Apps. Today I'll be talking about modernizing your mainframe integration with Logic Apps. For some time, we've had great on-prem mainframe integration with Host Integration Server. It covers all the major ZOS products. It provides a full SNA stack and SNA gateway. We have data providers for DB2 and vSAM that can be used in custom .NET applications or in BizTalk Office SQL Server. Our transaction integrator feature allows custom .NET applications to invoke CICS applications. For CICS applications that require 3270 screens, it has Session Integrator that provides programmatic access to the 3270 sessions, and the BizTalk MQ adapters allow access to IBM MQ servers. This solution has allowed customers to leverage .NET and other Microsoft servers for integration with their mainframe. But more and more, customers are wanting to take advantage of the cloud to be able to create serverless cloud solutions. To aid this transition, our team is working to bring the technology in HIS to Azure in the form of Logic Apps connectors. Today we have 2 new connectors targeting IBM integration. Earlier this year, we GA'd our IBM 3270 connector, which can drive 3270 applications from your workflow. Logic Apps Standard now includes a built-in MQ connector that fills many of the gaps of existing MQ connectors. On our roadmap of new built-in connectors, we have a host file connector that can read and write to offline vSAM files, a new DB2 connector with wider functionality than the existing connector, a CICS connector that will enable invoking a CICS transaction from your workflow, and an IMS DB connector that will allow workflows access to data in IMS databases. The 3270 connector is based on our session integrator technology. This technology was developed for cases where the screen logic and business logic could not be separated, so can only be driven by a 3270 screen. With a 3270 connector, you can drive a task in a 3270 application from your Logic Apps workflow. It is GA'd and available for production use. It's a consumption adapter at present, but there are plans to provide a built-in connector. It supports ICE environments, which provide VNet integration for access to on-prem mainframes. We have created a design tool that guides users through creating the custom metadata to drive their screens. It uses TN 3270 sessions to access the host, no SNA required. Added in the GA with support for structures and arrays. Here's an overview of how the connector works. A user would start in the 3270 design tool to record tasks or to record a task in their 3270 application. Define the navigation, define the in and out parameters, and once tested, they can generate the HIDX file containing the metadata. This file would be imported into their integration account, and when the 3270 action is added to the workflow, you can choose the HIDX file and it will dynamically include the parameters you've defined. When the action runs, a 3270 session will connect to your host and drive through the screens, inputting data to specific fields and returning data from the output fields. This returns data that can be used in subsequent actions in your workflow. Our newest connector is the MQ connector. This is a built-in connector available in Logic Apps Standard Workflow. With a standard workflow, you'll be able to develop and test your workflows in VS Code. With VS Code, you can test workflows against your on-prem resources. You can debug your workflows, deploy them to Azure. Once deployed to Azure, your Logic app can have VNet integration through an app service plan. Some of the new features are triggers, connection pooling, browse locking of messages, batch send and receives, message encoding, and TLS support. Here's an overview of the MQ connector. It's pretty straightforward compared to 3270 connector. You can develop the workflow in VS Code or in the portal, and you can connect to your host from both. The MQ connector supports 3 triggers. As IBM does not support any kind of callback mechanism, the triggers make a GET call against the queue with a configurable wait period. The GET call will return when a message arrives in the queue or when the wait interval expires. The wait interval can be user configurable to reduce the polling on the queue. The first trigger, when messages arrive in the queue, will trigger the workflow when there is a message in the queue, but it does not read the message. This will allow your workflow to do some processing before reading the message. The next 2 triggers will trigger the workflow when there is one or multiple messages in the queue and return one or multiple messages. One of the issues in the past with batch receives was running over the data limit of Logic Apps. We added a max batch size to keep the reads under this data limit. The difference between these two triggers is one will autocomplete, while the other will do a browse lock. The autocomplete trigger will do a normal read of the message, removing it from the queue. The browse lock trigger will read the message, but leave it on the queue in a lock state. Once the message has been successfully processed, there is a complete action to confirm, or if it's failed, then to abort the read. A common concern of customers is that the receive actions remove the message from the queue. If there is a failure in the workflow, the message will be lost. We added a browse action that will read the message, but leave it on the queue in a locked state. When it is a locked state, no one else can read the message until it is unlocked. There is also a complete action that can either commit or abort the read. The commit will remove the message from the queue, whereas the abort will remove the lock from the message, making it available on the queue. Also, if the workflow crashes, then the lock will automatically be removed by the MQ server. These actions have a single version and a multiple message version. Let's do a demo of this in action.
So I've made a simple workflow to demonstrate the browse lock and complete message handling. So in this workflow, I have a trigger that will fire when a message arrives in the queue, but it will do a browse lock on the message. I'm reading from a queue called Chris Howe. Then I'll do a send to a queue that doesn't exist. And this should fail. Let me move this over so you can see more. So I've set up a branch where I have a complete message that will do an abort, and this is set to run after if the send message failed or timed out. I then have a complete message that does a commit, run after set to. This will run if the send message was successful. And then I do a new read from a second queue and a send to a queue that does exist. So this should be successful. And then these are set up as the same as the messages above. So what should happen in this workflow is that the browse will read the message but lock it on the queue. This send message will send that content to a queue that doesn't exist, so fail. This will send it down this branch, and this message will abort the message. And so it'll stay on that Chris Howe queue. The next one will read a message from a second queue. This send will be successful, and then it'll be committed, and then we'll see the message move to a new queue. So let's put our messages in a queue. This is my MQ server. I'll use AMQ put. Put some messages in the queue. So. And then look up here, we'll see I have a message in the Chris Howe 2, and then I'll put one in the queue that will trigger the workflow. So now we have messages in both queues. Here, if we go to the overview, we can see that the workflow ran successfully. We see that we've got the message that was in the abort case is still left in the queue, and the one where we did a commit has been moved to the other queue. So we feel that this pattern will help you have more reliable reads. You can pull the message, process it, persist it, and then if that's all successful, commit it and pull it off the queue. And if it's not successful, then it remains on the queue and the message is lost. So I've made a simple workflow to demonstrate.
The connector supports receive and send actions for single messages and multiple messages. These actions support encoding of the messages for sends and receives. The multiple message actions also support configuring a max message count and a max batch size. Let's do a demo demonstrating the max message size.
This demo, I've created a simple logic app that I can trigger with a message, and then in my receive multiple messages, I've set the max batch size to 2 megabytes. And then my MQ series server, I have a queue that has 10 1 megabyte messages. And so every time I send a message to the queue to trigger it, it will read, should read 2 messages off of this queue and then put them in his return queue. So let's fire it off. So now I have 8 messages and 2 in the next queue. Pick it up again. Next go around, we should see the count go down to 6. There we have 6, and now 4 in the next queue. So this shows the ability to do a batch receives, but be able to set the maximum size. With Logic App Standard, the max data size is user configurable. But even if you set a size to 300 megabytes, sometimes it's unpredictable what size the messages coming in are, and this allows you to control the size of the message to keep it under the limit that you've set.
Our new roadmap for new built-in connectors includes 3 connectors for data integration and 2 connectors for application integration. The host file connector will allow your workflow to read and write from offline vSAM files. Because you cannot dynamically get schema from or vSAM files, the customer will need to use our Visual Studio Designer to define the schema and ideally from the Cobalt source, and then generate an HIDX file. The HIDX file will be used by the action to parse the vSAM files. The new DB2 connector will be a built-in connector and provide wider scope of support than the existing connector. We are planning to extend our Data Client to support IMS databases. This will allow you to create a connector similar to the DB2 connector and access your IMS DB databases from a workflow. The CICS connector will use our transaction integrator technology to allow your workflows to invoke CICS applications. The users will use our Visual Studio Designer to import their Cobalt source code and map the Cobalt data types to .NET data types, and then export that HIDX file, which will be used by the workflow at runtime. Well, thank you. I hope this technology and connectors will help you with your mainframe integration to modernize it in the future. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. Hopefully, as everyone can see, we're investing heavily across the integration portfolio that we have, bringing your IBM assets as well as your Microsoft ones together with Azure Integration Services, with investments in Logic Apps to build new connectors, even to be able to screen scrape those legacy applications without having to change them, as Chris talked about there with 3270, as well as being able to do heterogeneous messaging across different platforms using MQ with our new MQ connector support. So let's have a look at BizTalk now. So the BizTalk migration tool was built with one goal in mind, and that's to speed up your migration to Azure integration services. It's designed to reduce the amount of effort as well by being able to turn BizTalk applications into their equivalents in Azure integration services. So what it does is it takes the messaging patterns that BizTalk provides out of the box using its message box pub sub capabilities and maps those onto the equivalents in Azure integration services. Service bus with filtering to logic apps, for example, enables you to implement all the common messaging patterns that you're running in BizTalk today in the applications that you built, and turns them into AIS solutions by running the tool. It works with all versions from 2010 onwards, supported from, I think, 2013 R2, and it's also open source on GitHub, so you can even see kind of how it works and make modifications and improvements to it as well. We talked about this tool last year, so let's kind of just jump ahead and see what the tool can do, and then what we're planning on the roadmap. So it can do a lot. We have support for all the common adapters, file, FTP, and HTTP. BizTalk has been used predominantly for file-based communication, and of course, ubiquitous HTTP access. But what it does when you run it is that it generates a report from the MSI files that you export from your BizTalk environment. So you may not even have the source code for the solutions anymore. Doesn't matter. You can go to the admin console, export the MSIs, run the tool, and it'll tell you what it finds, even with sort of linked references between different BizTalk applications, kind of shred that, give you a report, and tell you what it can and can't do. So we have support for all the built-in out-of-the-box pipelines, XML receive, pass-through receive, and transmit, of course. And as I mentioned, with the messaging patterns, providing support for all the filtering capabilities like property promotion from schemas in demotion in the pipelines that get executed, and being able to put maps on the receive and send ports as well using the capabilities we have in Azure. As well as the pipelines themselves, you also get the pipeline components, including as well as XML, JSON, and flat file too. We also take orchestrations and convert those to their equivalents in logic apps. And the way we do this is there are some things that we do automatically, and then we kind of leave placeholders for you to complete the rest. The idea being is you're probably going to want to do some refactoring of those orchestrations in logic apps. So we kind of build the logic apps for you, and then you can kind of fill them out with the functionality as you want to implement it in Azure. And kind of underpinning all of this is a library of common capabilities, essentially, those messaging patterns that I talked about, that we give you as part of the tool that will create those underlying integration capabilities built on top of Azure integration services, and then convert those BizTalk projects into their equivalent solutions for you automatically. So what's on the roadmap? So this is really where we want to hear from you. There are a number of things we're planning, but there's also things that we would love to have you help us prioritize. So the most obvious one that we've already been asked by a number of you is, can we support the new standard logic app SKU? So this is the ability to target the single tenant offering that we have been talking about already this morning, and you'll hear a lot more about over the course of the next couple of days, so that you can take a BizTalk solution and convert it to the latest and greatest that we have in logic apps. Also coming is support for SCP and WCF adapters, sorry, I was going to say connectors. This allows you to map them to the equivalent functionality in Azure again. So I think this will cover off a big chunk of the use cases on top of the existing file, FTP and HTTP adapters that we have. We're also looking at performance improvements. It may or may not matter if you're doing a lot of file-based access. Performance may not be your primary criteria, but we're improving the performance and throughput of the converted solutions as well. And then one of the other things that we know is a gap right now is how to convert things that depend on the BizTalk rules engine. So we're doing some exploration there as well. So we have a survey here. We would love for you to fill this in. But what we're going to do now is actually ask you some questions directly. Bec, are you ready?
Yes, I am. So if everyone could go and navigate to your polls part of the Q&A platform. I'm about to go live with some polls, and we're going to actually get some feedback and make this interactive. So the first poll just gone live is Azure Integration Services on Azure Arc something you're considering? Some options there. Yes, I want to run my integrations on-prem. Yes, I want to run my integrations on multi-cloud. No, Azure for everything. That's fine with us. No, or I'm not ready to modernize. So we're going to get a live view of those particular answers coming in. So right now we're at about 60% running on premises. We've got about 19% running on multi-cloud. 15% of you want Azure for everything and are growing. Okay, we're up to 17% for that. And a couple of people in the audience, about 2% looking not ready to modernize. So John, any thoughts on that? Going to give everyone a couple more seconds to put in their feedback. Okay, ending the poll.
Yes, there's a 15 to 20-second delay, I think, on the video. So you see the poll immediately, but we can't see that you've seen it, or you won't hear us ask you to complete the questions. So then we have to wait 15, 20 seconds for you to do that. So the joys of live streaming. The joys of live streaming. Okay, well, we've got some good responses there. So just to wrap up on that, a lot of you, majority, are looking to run integrations on premises. So we're really excited to see how the Azure Arc enabled capabilities do unlock this for you. About 16% want to run multi-cloud, and 25% of you want to run Azure for everything. So that is great. The guidance for this going forward is if you can use a managed service on Azure, absolutely do it. We have the Arc enabled Kubernetes services if you need that control and you need to run off Azure. But by no means does that mean that Azure is not the preferred place to run your integrations. Okay, so second poll is now live. So the question is, do you currently run BizTalk? We have a couple of folks in the audience, about 16% who are running BizTalk 2020, 50% 2016, 15% running an older version, and about 20% of the audience not running BizTalk at all. So hope that some of the things we've been talking about have been relevant for you in this session. So with that question, I'm going to add another one to the poll, and that is, have you already started modernizing your BizTalk applications? So for the 17 and 50% of you who do run BizTalk, and for the 17% who do run an older version, have you started to modernize? Is this something you're thinking about? Would love to see where everyone is at in the audience. Give that a couple of seconds to complete. Right now, it's very much neck and neck between, yes, I use Azure Integration Services where possible, and also no, I'm still running my integrations on BizTalk. And so while that one is completing, and we'll go back and have a look at the results after this, I'm going to add another question to the poll, and that is, have you already tried using the BizTalk integration tool? Sorry, the BizTalk migration tool in this case. Live, well, the poll should say BizTalk migration tool, but there you go. So we can see if you do have BizTalk, are you using the BizTalk modernization / migration tool to help you do those migrations for you? So majority is no, we've got 20% who have used the tool. So for those 20% who've used the tool, the next question off the block is, if it's a yes and you have used migration tool and you haven't completely moved everything off BizTalk or used it to modernize your BizTalk application, what would you like us to add next to help make the tool even more productive and accelerate your migrations that little bit extra? So the options for that is advanced performance, more adaptive support, Logic App standard support, and business rules engine support.
Now, while I wait for those answers to come on in, I'm going to go back and talk about some of the results from the earlier questions. Okay, so lots of us running BizTalk 2016. 20%, around 16, 70% are running BizTalk on older versions. And we've got a good chunk of the audience, 17% running on BizTalk 2020, who've already made the migration. For those who have started the modernization journey, it seems a majority of the audience now use Azure integrations where possible. So that's awesome. Take advantage of all the latest and greatest with cloud native. And about 34% are still running all integrations on BizTalk. Out of this group, it seems majority haven't used the BizTalk migration tool. So we're interested to know why. So that's where the last question comes in. And it seems that the biggest piece of requested functionality is Logic App standard support. So John, any questions, any thoughts on those particular answers?
I can't see the poll. It's kind of funny because I joined as a moderator and actually make them go live, but I can't see the results. So I think it makes sense, right? I think we're not surprised that a reasonable number of you are running on older unsupported versions of BizTalk. It's just the way it goes, right? Again, it's one of the advantages of once you have invested in upgrading and migrating that you actually kind of then evergreen because it's a power service and we kind of do that work for you. I guess, I think what I would say is if there's any kind of other answers besides the ones that we have, you can throw those into the chat or the Q&A so we can kind of capture that as well. I know we're trying to kind of box these into sort of neat and tidy categories, but if there's other reasons why you don't want to migrate, can't migrate, then you can throw those in there. If there's other things that are blocking you from using the tool, then we're very interested to kind of hear that as well. So feel free to just kind of ask the questions in the Q&A or ask them in the chat.
Yeah, and one more, just building off that, John, that I just added in, you mentioned if there's something blocking you, we want to know about. So the next question in the poll is, what is your biggest blocker to modernizing? The options for that are waiting for Azure integrations on Azure Arc general availability. We know that a lot of customers don't use particular services until they are GA. Service Bus is Azure only, so getting that equivalent messaging per system on-prem, is that a blocker for you? Overall efforts to migrate, and I'm planning to move to BizTalk 2020 first. And so a quick poll of the results there, it looks like it's an equal footing between it's the overall effort to migrate / customers folks are waiting to migrate to BizTalk 2020 first before they start thinking about modernization.
Yeah, and just looking at the results, I can actually see this one. So again, not surprisingly, a lot of customers we talk to want to kind of get in a great place first by upgrading to 2020 before they start thinking about whether to target Azure integration for new development and then kind of looking at migration after that. So that doesn't make sense. I guess the effort to migrate is kind of interesting, and one if you have specific feedback, we would love to kind of dig into that as well in terms of what's causing you to pause in terms of the effort needed versus, for example, the effort in migrating from BizTalk 2010, if you're kind of running that or an older out of support version to 2020 and the multiple hops that kind of requires and testing and everything else. We're very interested to kind of hear that as well.
One more question going live, and then we can open up to Q&A because we are at time.
Yep.
So the last question there is, and if I go live with this, what are your future plans? We've talked about some of the new ways you can modernize your BizTalk environments as well as your mainframes. We do have a migration tool. We do have a roadmap for updates. I'd love to hear your feedback. So as mentioned, put your requests either in Q&A or fill in the aka.ms/BizTalk migration survey form. We do monitor this, so if there's anything that you do need, if there's anything blocking you, we want to hear about it. So last question in terms of feedback, then we'll open up to Q&A is, what are your future plans? It seems Lots of people are waiting for Azure integration services on-prem, and that makes sense with about 50% of us wanting to run our migrations on-prem. A lot are planning a migration to BizTalk 2020, and then an equal footing between the other options there. Jon, any closing remarks on the polls and the Q&A aspect?
No, that sounds great, and I really appreciate all of you participating, kind of answering the questions for us. It really does help us prioritize. I know we're kind of right at time now, so do we have any questions worth looking at the Q&A?
We should have some questions in the moderation panel, which a lot have been answered.
Exactly, indeed. I've moderated a number of questions, so you can have a look at them. Meanwhile, I'm pushing more questions, from pending to accepted. Can you view them yourself, or do you want me to read them out?
I can take the ARC one. Billing is yet to be announced for ARC enabled services, so it is still in public preview, and insights into billing will become more clear closer to general availability.
Yeah, and part of the reason for that is it's about integration and application development, right? So we want to get this right, and we want to understand from you. There's an earlier question that I saw about, can we make it easier to kind of buy this stuff? And the intent when you run things in Azure Arc is you are going to deploy multiple services to a Kubernetes cluster, right? And that's really the value proposition, is making it manageable. So it makes sense if if you see the value in the business model kind of being simplified with that as well. But again, for different people, that can mean different things. So again, feel free to kind of add any more information in the chat so that we can kind of see how you would like us to give you access to this and how to package it.
The next question is Arc mandatory to bring integration services to my cluster somewhere else than Azure? So I can take that one and say that this is not the beginning of our journey. We've been on this journey for a while. So you can currently today run your Azure functions or your API gateways as containers. Now these run as standalone containers. They're a way to scale them, they're a way to manage them. But essentially, because they run in containers, everything to do with running that container, managing it, scaling it, supporting it, that is in your realm of responsibility. The difference between running standalone containers and Azure Arc is you get the full PaaS developer experience. So for example, for Logic Apps, you get that run history, you get the monitoring UI, which you don't get when you run in standalone containers. For Azure Functions, the scale and Kata support is already built into the platform, so you don't have to manage the scaling of those containers. And for the actual layer that runs the application platform services, under the hood, this all runs on containers, but you can deploy your applications in your normal zip deploy mechanisms without needing to go through and manage and maintain those container images. So it does add simplification to running your services on-prem when you use Azure Arc.
There's a bunch of questions. I'm not sure we're going to get through all these, but we will answer them offline. Lex, do you want us to wrap up, or do we have time?
That's fine. I mean, well, it's up to you, right? If you would like to take a couple of more questions, that's totally fine. Let me see. We still have close to 200 people in the call.
Yep.
So again.
So I just answered one. Will there be a BizTalk 2022? As you can probably see in the answer, it wouldn't make sense, I don't think, if we did that. It's always been on a sort of 4-year, approximately ship cycle for full versions. So 2022 would only be 2 years after 2020. So that's not something that's in the works. HL7, that is something, I don't know where Divya is here, but that is something we are looking at in terms of how we can provide full HL7 support. We already have Fire support, if you're familiar with that, which is essentially the replacement for HL7 by virtue of the fact we have Fire on Azure and we have connectors for that. So we do have healthcare support, but HL7 V2, specifically the XML, I'm guessing is a big deal. So sorry, not XML, it's V3. The flat file version is something we're looking at.
I'll take a question. So there's one on asks ARM template, Terraform, or Arc-enabled logic apps, which one's best for integration. ARM and Terraform are really the mechanisms that you use to deploy your logic apps. So really the choice comes down to whether you want consumption or standard on Azure Arc. So the first choice comes down to what tooling you prefer, whether that is ARM or Terraform. We are looking into support for Terraform for standard, so that is something that is on our roadmap. But you can use Terraform with consumption today. When it comes to choosing the SKU that you run your logic app on, you've got consumption, standard, or standard on Azure Arc. Really, that comes down to how you want to run it and where you want to run it. If you want consumption-based scaling and you only foresee running on Azure, then that is absolutely a fine option. If you need things like VNet integration and some of the newer capabilities of the standard SKU, then you would use standard. And of course, if you need to deploy to other regions of Azure, then you would be using the standard SKU / single tenant mode to run on those other platforms.
So there's a couple of questions around cost. So these are interesting because it really speaks to why we introduced Logic App Standard. That and I'm not sure we've explained so far what the difference is between cloud and the built-in connectors. You know, Chris mentioned the MQ connector is built in, so I'll just spend 30 seconds talking about that. Logic Apps consumption, as it's been for the last few years, essentially you pay per action, right? And depending on whether the action is a connector or a logic action, depends on the rate at which you pay. Logic App Standard changes that significantly because all the logical actions and a certain number of the connectors are all built into the runtime. So it's actually in the engine itself, and you don't pay extra for running those connectors, which is SQL, now MQ, Event Hub, and Service Bus. So there's no additional cost to pay anymore when you're doing these kind of high volume workloads, which is what we kind of expect when you're using things like Service Bus and Event Hub and even MQ. You're just paying for the compute, and you're in control in terms of how you set the scaling rules up. So it can be dramatically more cost effective depending on the type of workload you're running than consumption, and certainly compared with BizTalk Server if you're looking at buying licenses for that. So it's worth kind of understanding the cost model in terms of how standard changes. We did release in terms of our doc updates last week a whole doc that kind of explains this, the difference between consumption and standard. So I'd encourage you to kind of check that out and have a look and see whether it will work out for you. I don't know whether Bec is worth talking about the pricing calculator as well that you've been working on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the new standard SKU, we give you the keys of the kingdom in terms of where you store your state and execution history. This is great because you get more control about where that and how that runs, how you back it up if you want GRS or RAGRS or just local redundant storage. So you get a bunch of control there, but you also now see all those operations on your build. So to help provide transparency in terms of what those operations are doing, how many they run per workflow run, we have a Azure Logic Apps calculator, which actually takes in your workflow definition. It will ask you a couple of questions such as how many times you want to run it, how many times your for each is execute, and how large your data payloads are. This all translates into storage executions behind the scenes, whether it's writing to a queue, writing to tables, and writing to Azure Blob. And then on the output of that, we actually say, okay, this is how many operations are going to run per month. And then you can plug that directly into the Azure pricing calculator to get those costs for your storage backend. Because costs are pretty small, when I say pretty small, I mean micro cents, you need to be running quite a number of workflow executions to be able to see a big impact on your build, but it's always good to be aware of what your services cost. So use the estimator tool and provide feedback.
Yeah, sorry, I'm literally answering some questions in the Q&A now.
Yeah, there are plenty.
Yeah, you know, again, there's more questions that kind of around the built-in model. This is obviously kind of interesting. One of the questions is, and hits on one of the other motivations for us while we did this, is does it change the throughput characteristics? Are you subjected to the same throttle and throughput limits that you have with cloud connectors? And the answer is yes, it does change them. And you even have access, and we've documented this as well, to some of the settings that control those throughput settings. So you can now get much higher rates of throughput for messaging than you could before with standard, and you can control things like the degrees of parallelism for each loops and other things beyond the limits that we have in the consumption service. So essentially, you now have the ability to change the host settings and tune your environment to the workload to get the maximum amount of throughput. Honestly, the maximum sort of bang for your buck in terms of the compute that you're paying for and the throughput that you can get for that without being subject to kind of limits or throttles.
I'll take another one. The question is the Logic App Runtime GA in GA ready for AWS EKS? So if you want to run the Logic App Runtime on another Kubernetes platform, such as EKS, GCP, or even AKS or on-prem, that particular platform is in public preview. That was announced last week at Build. So while our runtime is GA, the actual Azure Arc enabled platform is in public preview. So I would recommend always, if you're going to be hosting things off Azure, Azure Arc enabled app services will provide the best experience for you.
Okay, I think we're way over time now. We'll keep hanging out here and answering questions, but we should probably hand back to you now, Alex, to close things out.
Yeah, sure.
So I want to say thanks to everybody for joining us, and I hope this is useful, and keep the questions coming. Thanks.
Covey.co